Hey guys, I'm Key from Travel Made Personal, and this is part 2 of my Florida Romantic Ghost Towns series, possibly inspired by William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Last week we talked about the sister communities of Capulet and Montague. In Shakespeare's play, Montague and Capulet were the two rival families of Romeo and Juliet. But in terms of Marion County, Florida, were the communities of Montague and Capulet inspired by two local rival families, or were the pioneers of these communities just lovers of William Shakespeare? We don't know a lot about Capulet. Even its location is in question, as it never showed up on any maps of Florida. But we did find its cemetery, and can surmise from the location of the cemetery that the town of Capulet was in the surrounding area. We know that Capulet was named by a self-educated man that loved Shakespeare named S.S. Savage, who was born and raised in Capulet. The town had a church right next to the cemetery and a school, but never a post office. Folks would go to nearby Montague to get their mail. And the church was destroyed by a tornado in 1928, and according to onlookers, the floor was picked up and moved several hundred feet away, leaving the pews and the Bible on the pulpit intact. We know about the same amount of information about Montague. It was a small black farming community. Some suggest it was started by freed slaves back in the mid-1800s. It had a post office, general store, and a population of 100 by 1911 and 1912. The post office operated from 1886 to 1915. What I found particularly fascinating was how the community was brought together by Reverend John Brooke Panay. He had built a school in this community he retired in and taught children and adults alike on weekdays and preached to them on Sundays. He and his wife's graves are all that's left of this once tight-knit community. Today, we'll walk through the history of Romeo Ghost Town in Marion County, Florida. It's located on Northwest 190th Avenue off of U.S. Highway 41, just past the railroad tracks. The ghost towns of Romeo and Juliet sat to the west of Ocala. You'll notice Juliet is spelled differently than Shakespeare spelled it. Romeo and Juliet were small pioneer communities just a few miles from each other, sitting on what is now Highway 41. The local legend is that the two communities of Romeo and Juliet had two lovers, one living in each of the communities, the guy in Romeo and the lady in Juliet. Allegedly, their marriage was halted by their parents, but the couple continued meeting each other anyway in secret until one died in an accident. But were they truly inspired by William Shakespeare? Well, let's dive into the history of these areas. So let's go back to the mid-1800s, just after the Seminole Wars and Florida's statehood being granted on March 3, 1845. Railways were expanding, and the agriculture in the area led to many pocket communities blooming in this area. We've learned from local historian David Cook, who retired as associate editor of the Star-Banner, that the settlers in this area were well read, to say the least. In fact, aside from reading the Bible, many of the area pioneers were familiar with the work of Shakespeare. This is further confirmed by 1930s Florida State Librarian William Thomas Cash in his 1945 book, Florida Becomes a State. Mr. Cash mentioned in his writing that Floridians were avid readers and that the works of Byron, Milton, Shakespeare, and others could be found on their bookshelves. Now, Romeo is probably the oldest of the four settlements, yet it is still an active community today, even though it is now considered a ghost town. Romeo was settled as a community of pastoralism in the 1850s, meaning farming focused on raising livestock on natural pastures. It was first divided into tracts somewhere around 1880. The addition of the unincorporated Rainbow Lakes Estates development in South Romeo was developed sometime prior to 2020 as a municipal services district. In his 1969 book, Dunellen, Boomtown of the 1890s, Dunellen historian J. Lester Dinkins wrote that settlers in northwestern Marion County had homesteaded land there, planting Sea Island cotton, watermelons, and the usual grain and cover crops. A thriving little farming community existed and soon became known as Romeo. According to Mr. Dinkins, the post office was established January 17, 1885, with a one-year hiatus, and then was permanently closed on April 30, 1955. Romeo had a few general stores, one of which belonged to Romeo Turpentine Company. I was able to find a wanted ad in the November 1911 issue of Naval Stores Review and Journal of Trade. Perhaps they were seeking someone to manage the store. It seems the stores are all gone now, the last one having reportedly burned down. I also found a news article referencing the April 1966 50th wedding anniversary of Clifford F. Smith, captain, and his wife Natalie. Apparently, after they wed in 1916, they settled in Romeo, where Mr. Smith worked in the turpentine business before they moved to Ocala in 1941, and he became warden of Camp, which is how he earned the title of captain. Camp was the Marion County prison farm southeast of Ocala. Back then, the warden of any prison facility was traditionally given the title of captain. Mr. Smith had dual responsibilities in Marion County, both as the warden and as the superintendent of roads throughout his career there. They moved to Bellevue after he retired at 79 years old, but he still oversaw a small cattle operation in Romeo on the family farm. I'll talk a little more about phosphate mines later, but for now, just know that the Camp Road Prison was established after the Florida legislature prohibited prisoners being leased to work in phosphate mines in 1901, and subsequently prohibited the leasing of pioneers to individuals or businesses in 1923. But a convict labor pool was created to build and maintain Florida roadways. Prisoners convicted of misdemeanors were housed at Camp, which raised its own food and provided prison labor for public works and road projects. The prison grounds covered several acres on both sides of Camp Road, now known as Southeast 17th Street, but it closed in the 1960s. Today, some of the buildings are used for county engineering and some by the Marion County Fire Rescue. A Florida cold freeze was what sealed the fate for the now defunct town of Romeo. Unfortunately, this was the case for many small towns in Florida at that time. In fact, in 1894 and 95, the freezes killed off every orange tree in the area, which caused a lot of the small towns to go into default, since everything was based on Florida's oranges. Oranges made up such a significant part of Florida's economy at that time that the Great Freeze caused the mining company to leave too. So my visit to Romeo lasted about an hour, maybe close to 2, because I took a walk along the railroad tracks. Something I've noticed with old historic places, especially ghost towns, is that the GPS will take you to the general area, but isn't always real precise about your actual destination. My GPS took me to Romeo, but I had to do a little driving around before I spotted some old abandoned vehicles on the side of a natural sandy road. So I drove over to the vehicles and took some pictures of them. I didn't touch them. I am a firm believer of visiting places and taking nothing but memories with me. As a Cub Scout leader, I taught leave no trace. I always try to abide by that, with the only exception being my footprints in the sand. I really wanted to open the doors of the vehicles and see if anything was inside them, but I didn't. I felt it would be disrespectful to go through somebody else's property, whether they abandoned it or not. Not judging others, that's just the way I am. I couldn't help but notice that a couple of them were garbage trucks, which still had the company name on the side of them. Those didn't look like they were from the early 1900s, so I think they were abandoned within the past few decades. But some of the other vehicles looked older and seemed like they may have been sitting there a lot longer, what with nature growing through them and all. As I finished up photographing the vehicles, I started walking along the old sandy road to see what else was nearby. I saw a mailbox that looked fairly new sitting there by its lonesome on an empty lot, and as I walked by it, I saw the old Romeo Church of God. I went back to my truck and drove to the church just to stay close to my vehicle since I was out in a remote location by myself. Safety first, right? As I drove to the church, I saw the old cemetery back behind it and off to the side, so I started there. As I walked among the small cemetery, I couldn't help but wonder how old the graves actually were. The burial vaults looked a little old, but they didn't seem to be a century old. The headstones confirmed that they aren't that old. Some were as recent as 2020. Based on the headstones on each grave, I would guess that the Romeo residents of the past were buried elsewhere. There were only about a dozen graves in this little cemetery, so maybe there's a hidden cemetery that I haven't found yet. Walking through the cemetery, I felt peaceful. I don't generally get spooked in cemeteries, though. There have been one or two where I felt watched or I thought I heard something like a growl, but I had no such eeriness in this one. Just a general sadness that I was in the presence of lives lost. After walking through the cemetery, I walked around the outside of the church. It really doesn't seem like it's been abandoned for very long, maybe a few decades, if that. I did find it a little eerie that there were still curtains hanging in the windows, but I couldn't see much more than that inside the church. The church and parking lot were both pretty small compared to churches of today, and nature has started reclaiming the church grounds. Behind the church, I found a small section of grounds surrounded by wood beams, shown in the middle picture here, but I couldn't tell what it was for. I looked for grave markers or signs of playground equipment in the area, but I saw none. If you happen to know what this area would have been used for, let me know in the comments below. I did spot a bird bath and some froggy friends as I walked by to the front of the church, though. Subtle reminders that there once was life in this area. After visiting the church, I took a stroll along the railroad tracks to just peek into the woods and see if I could spot any other remnants of old Romeo. The old road was blocked just past an intersection by a fallen tree and some old concrete blocks. I couldn't tell what the concrete came from, but I could tell I wouldn't be able to climb over the debris without much risk of another broken ankle, so I took to the train tracks. I saw lots of spiders and an old sheet of rusty metal. That's about it. If I would have continued following the tracks long enough, maybe 3 or 4 blocks, I would have walked to some old charcoal kilns. I did pull over as I drove out of Romeo and snap a couple of pictures of the furnaces. They sit in front of an old plant that has since been repurposed. The plant is much newer than the furnaces, but the old charcoal enterprise was built in the 1960s by Pioneer Charcoal Company. Charcoal was in high demand in the 1960s, according to the Dunellen Historical Society, because people started doing a lot of backyard barbecuing in the late 50s after World War II. There were a lot of large turkey oak trees in the area, which just happened to produce wonderful charcoal. So that about wraps up the ghost town of Romeo. While it's not a municipality with its own government like Dunella and Ocala are, the town does still exist, and people do still live there. In fact, Romeo Elementary School is still open today in what is now known as Dunellen, Florida. Historically, the town of Romeo was and still is on the map and is a recognized place. Be sure to stay tuned for next week's video on the ghost town of Juliet, and be sure to like and subscribe so you get notified of the other interesting places I explore. I don't only visit ghost towns, you know. Okay, so I'll see you back here next week, same bat time, same bat channel. Until then, keep on exploring.